part of the study that I will talk about today as well, which is dying to be kind. And that's really what we'll talk a little bit about. So facing mortality then to become a little bit kinder and to have more empathy. And what I want to try and do in the next about 40 minutes, just to give us enough time at the end for a discussion, which might be more fruitful perhaps, is just to unpick a little bit about why we need to talk about death and why we talk about death. To talk a little bit about the concepts of cultural silence and mortality salience as well. Um, Also to discuss a little bit of the study, which is one part of a bigger study, which is a randomized control trial. So we will talk a little bit more about what indications and what data we receive from a proof of concept study so far on this subject, and then to unpick what that all means and why we care about it. So that's really what we want to do today. And I want to begin with a quiet moment of reflection, if you like. And I'd like to invite everybody who's in the room to think back to the last time you became aware of your own mortality. And it doesn't need to be something dramatic or catastrophic, but something subtle. So something that unmistakable, one of those moments that unmistakably kind of reminds us the way of life, which sometimes reminds us that the end is somewhere there as well. So that could have been a health scare or a near miss on the road, for example, or maybe a birthday that felt a little bit heavier than usual. And whatever that was for every person, we want to notice what shifted in you, in this case, in myself, in us. So what was it that made us think a little bit differently in that moment? Did we start prioritizing the challenge, the things we do in life, or priorities? The priorities change the way we arrange the things we want to do in life. And did certain relationships perhaps feel more urgent, or certain worries became less so in that moment? Um, and I want to kind of invite you to think in these terms, because we don't often, as people, pause in all these busy lives we run to consider these moments. And this is not something accidental. It is, in fact, something very much structured within the societies we live in, and we'll talk more about that later. But more broadly, in many cultures, and particularly in cultures where um, cultures that have been shaped quite strongly by religious traditions or have been very tightly knit by social norms, talking about death is often quite discouraged, or it is softened. So we talk about passing away and moving on and passing on. We don't talk about death or dying particularly. Or they are avoided altogether, and especially within societies where there is a lot of historic roots of superstition. And that is treated as or maybe the subject of death in conversations is sometimes treated as impolite or as morbid or something dangerous, as though if you name it, you might summon it. And it reminds us a bit of Gore's work in the 50s, where he talked about the pornography of death and how we don't talk about sex or sexuality or death altogether. And there was a study that we conducted about 15 years ago with colleagues internationally, where in fact it was the reverse. And it was a conversation about sex amongst teenagers that educational systems didn't want to employ because there was the fear that then it would happen. And it was about the study was quite interesting in relation to death, because it was when you talk about it, you might get pregnant. And when you talk about death, you might die. And there was that alignment. Um, but here's the paradox of that avoiding mortality doesn't quite protect us from fear. So in fact, it often amplifies the fear. So when we push death to the margins of our own awareness, we also push away the opportunities for preparedness, for meaning making, or for deeper connections with other people. And the absence of conversation doesn't create safety as we think it does, but it creates uncertainty. And it reminds me of various studies that have taken place. And there's been a core study that took place about 10 years ago in Romania, for example, looking at how animated films and conversations to children about death actually are masked in such ways where there's that illusion of creating safety. And so we position children in front of animated and cartoons, animated films to distract them from the realities of life. But in fact, all those films communicate death. That's the root of animation. Um, so today, I want to make the case, in fact, based on that study that I will talk about, that talking about death is not only possible, but it's also profoundly beneficial. And so that's what we want to start looking at. Um, and in order to do so, I need to cover a couple of bits and pieces there to cover the basis. So I want to turn to the idea of cultural silence around death, which is a pattern that we see across many societies, though it does take different forms depending on the history of a particular context, the religion, the social norms, the traditions, and so forth. But in a surprising number of cultures, death is treated as a taboo topic. And of course, saying taboo topic is in itself quite contested internationally, especially in literature and research. But what I refer to here is not just that it is sensitive, not just that, but something that should be kept at the edges, at the margins of any conversation. So people learn early on that talking about death can be morbid or spiritually dangerous. And so the subject becomes something we jostle away, we gesture toward indirectly or avoid altogether. And families start shielding their members from and children from funerals, for example, not to be exposed to those realities. Or workplaces may discourage open grief. And we quite often in employment studies, in fact, have seen where big organizations would endorse people to take on tasks in employment which will help them be distracted from their grief. And so using that as a mechanism as well in a more constructed way. But this silence has consequences. And when we don't talk about death, we also don't talk about our own mortality. And that creates a kind of emotional detachment, a distance from the reality that we are finite beings, that we have an end at some point. And while that distance might feel protective, it often does the opposite. And avoidance tends to increase what we call thanatophobia, so the fear of death, because what we refuse to face becomes larger, more abstract, and more threatening in our imagination. Another consequence of the cultural silence is also what researchers call complicated grief. And of course, that has been debated in so many different forms and in the biomedical models of grief. But when somebody dies, people who have never been encouraged to speak openly about death often find themselves struggling to process the loss. And that's what research is telling us. So they may feel more isolated or more unsure how to express those emotions or pressured to that typical nudge that we hear grievers receiving, which is that moving on. So we'll have to move on, and time will help us to move on. And that, of course, kind of indicates that low death literacy, sort of that limited understanding of what dying involves and what options really exist for care. How do we navigate the more practical and more emotional dimensions at the end of life, whether we are the one dying or the one grieving? And this does bring us to another important point that death is not only a biological event, it is socially constructed, hence the constructivist perspective. So every culture provides a very specific script or specific scripts for how death should be handled. So in some places, religious authorities mediate the entire process, from last rites to burial, and those can create a sense of order, but also start limiting personal agency. So we have to think about the balance between scripture and guidance and instructions versus personal agency. In fact, that does remind me of an anecdote that I have included in one of my books, where when we talk about freedom of choice in end of life care, and in fact, what we mean by freedom of choice is freedom of choice, not of creating choices. So we are not free to create the choices. We're free to choose of the choices from the choices that we have been given. And there's an anecdote that if somebody's choice is to be eaten by a grizzly bear, that is not an option really. So it's not a choice. So their freedom is limited to that. So these cultural scripts can be comforting for sure because they provide that kind of familiar environment, but they can also they can also constrain us. And when the only acceptable conversations about death are ritualized or formalized, we lose that ability that we were to have to talk about mortality in everyday life, to be able to ask questions, to express fears, or make plans. I come from a culture where if a child were to ask a question around death, they would be told off because it goes back to that idea of summoning it. And it's like, you shouldn't speak about these things. And that's not an uncommon trait in a culture. But to understand why death feels so culturally constrained today, it helps to look at how our relationship with mortality has also changed over time. And I don't want to dwell too much on this because of time, but I think it's quite useful to go back to that staged timeline that Arias has offered us, the historian, where it starts from the medieval times that he talks about tamed death. So the death that is integrated into daily life. There's communal rituals, there's community, there's discussions openly in the community, and that moves into the next era of death of the self. So there's a particular focus on the experiences of the dying person, and then that changes and goes on to that period that is marked with a more emotional intensity about the death of the other. So mourning in that period becomes more expressive, more sentimental, and more centered on the bereaved, if you like. And then, of course, we come to the place of privatization of death, the privatization of death, which is still one of the very contemporary kind of realities, if you like, where, medicalization, institutionalization, globalization, all those concepts and processes in societies have contributed towards that. And of course, when something has been privatized, it means that it's no longer available for public discourse, which starts intensifying that cultural silence that I've mentioned earlier. And what it becomes is, and I like kind of try via images to show this, is that we go from the square of the village, the traditional kind of community that talks openly about something, onto those more modern structures of a hospital that we lock things behind the door. And so that's a little bit about how the history of the conversation of death looks like across cultures, with some exceptions, especially within indigenous cultures. Um, but modern scholars as well, and like Littlewood and Milford and Elias and Pickering, they have talked around this, and they try to reframe and revisit those ideas by areas. But particularly, what they highlighted was that death does remain privatized, but the taboo that we talk about and the illusion that, or the delusion that we have developed in the 21st century, that the taboo goes away or that we start talking a lot more openly about death, is only the outcome of what secularization might do, which is to strip naked from any language that has emotionality or is death related when discussing death, and simply discuss death as a fact. And it's not the death of the self, but the death of the other. So we're very comfortable talking about a disaster we watch on the news, and we see how many people died and how many people, were shot in a school somewhere, and how many people were murdered in a genocide. So we're comfortable to watch that, and we still go on with our lives, but we're still not comfortable with that conversation with our own homes. And I want us to start unpicking that in relation to mortality awareness. So, to understand, I guess, what or why cultural silence around death has such a powerful effect on us, we do need to look at what it does to us psychologically. And this is where I guess Ernest Becker's work and terror management theory. So apologies, I should have spelled this out. So TMT, terror management theory, are very important. So Becker argued that humans are unique in one fundamental way, that we live with the knowledge that we will die. And we can imagine our own non-existence, and which is very unique as opposed to many other animals on the earth. Um, and that awareness that we have creates a very deep existential tension and a kind of background hum, if you like, of anxiety, sort of a bit of anxiety that will never fully disappear. And terror management theory builds on this idea. It shows that when our mortality becomes salient, or in other words, when something reminds us that we will one day die, like me talking here today, we automatically activate some psychological defenses. And those defenses aren't conscious quite often, but they're built into how we maintain our own emotional stability. And they tend to cluster around three main areas. So we have self-esteem, and these are important because they're key value variables in the study that I will unpick in a second. So, self-esteem, which helps us be reassured that our lives matter, that we're important. So, that idea about legacy. Cultural worldviews, which give us a sense of order and a sense of meaning and a sense of continuity. And social belonging, of course, because that becomes very significant in relation to self-esteem as well. And these buffers work remarkably well, but only when they're supported by more open cultural narratives. And when death becomes unspeakable, when we're discouraged from naming or exploring our fears, those defenses then become quite brittle, quite sensitive. And avoidance then doesn't quite make mortality go away. It simply pushes it, I guess, into, under the carpet. It swipes it under the carpet until it becomes much harder to be able to manage. Um, and essentially, and that derives from prior research in the area that this study has focused on as well, which is that the less we talk about death more generally, the more anxious we become during our lifetimes and while living. So we're becoming more anxious people. And just a couple of notes about thanatophobia, because I've mentioned it earlier more in passing, but it's not simply, thanatophobia is not simply an individual trait. It's not something that has accountability, the accountability is with the individual, but it is shaped by culture. So when a society discourages that open conversation about death, people start losing the chance to process anticipatory emotions in a more healthy way or in a healthier way. And those emotions don't disappear, but they start accumulating and they become that suppressed anticipatory emotion stage. So we have intensified emotions when the imminent death comes because there's never been a time during our lifetimes to healthily process them. And again, I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I do want to highlight it because it's the pathway to why this study is important or looking into these matters is important. So, what happens when we do talk about death? Um, the what happens are three main things. So on the left of the screen, so you're looking at the screen, this diagram, there are three key things that do happen. The first one is increasing the emotional preparedness. So talking about death allows us to name the fears we have, to clarify the values we have in life, to start imagining scenarios in life that would otherwise feel a bit more overwhelming. And that refers to having open conversations about what decisions people might want to make with their loved ones. So, for example, we take our life for granted. So one day we die and our loved one doesn't quite know what to do. What is it that we wanted to do when we die? What do we How do we respond to the rituals? How do we engage with them from a dead body's perspective, if I put it that way? The second is that it helps us improve grief outcomes. So people who have had conversations about death, whether that was their own death or the death of others that were close to them, they tend to navigate bereavement with a much greater resilience. And the third impact there of death talk is that it strengthens relationships. So those conversations often help deepen intimacy that we have with people around us. But of course, the religion and spiritual frameworks are very significant in most cultures, and they are a key part of the history of humanity and human societies. And they do play a complex role in shaping the conversations we have, how we have those conversations about death and grief. And on the one hand, they can offer extraordinary support. So they help us have a framework for meaning-making narratives or ritual structures or communities that bring people together through loss. But these frameworks can um, can normalize death and situate it within a larger scope, sort of cosmology, if you like. And they do provide a language for emotions that otherwise we might not know how to talk about. But simultaneously, those frameworks can also become or create constraints and limitations for us. So some traditions discourage an open, I guess, emotional expression while putting that emphasis on stoicism or faith over vulnerability. Um, there are examples like um, unintentionally there are examples of unintentionally silencing people during rituals, in fact, and a very, very, very vivid example that we see in many cultures is that of the phrase when somebody dies, the religious response, which is that they're in a better place, right? And of course, immediately that means that there's that unintentional silencing of the person who's grieving because they should be grateful that their loved one is in a better place than they were before, right? And it almost becomes a tendency to disenfranchise that grief that a person is experiencing. So we have to be mindful of those limitations that perhaps might become kind of openly clear to us in those situations. So, across many laboratory-based studies, we have seen what this particular study has examined that exploration of um, um, the links between mortality, salience, self-esteem, and prosocial behavior. So self-esteem and prosocial behavior as umbrella terms to cover anything around empathy, kindness, community, sense of belonging, and so forth. And unfortunately, it requires many hours to go through all of this together. So today we're kind of having a snippet of that. But across many studies and some of the key studies in this area are by these colleagues up here. Um, have found very consistent patterns, in fact. And when people are subtly reminded of their mortality, they often show increases in self-esteem related behaviors. So, when it comes to a sense of personal significance and importance and sense of self, there's more an increased adherence to cultural norms. There's increased tendencies for helping, for sharing with others, for charitable giving, for contributing to the community, and for having a bigger sense of collaboration, wanting to engage with others as well. So with evidence, we know from research that this is what conversations about death can lead to. But that data is based in laboratories. So in terms of real life or real world examples, we have very, very few. And one of them is by Vale and Joel. And that has shown, again, similar effects nevertheless. So when people start contemplating their own mortality, they often start reporting greater clarity about their own values in life, a stronger social bonds with their community and with other people, an increased motivation to pursue more growth-oriented goals, and a bigger desire to be able to contribute to something larger than themselves and move a little bit away from that egocentric approach to life that quite naturally humans adapt to. And one interpretation is that of all of this is that prosocial behavior becomes a form of symbolic immortality. And I think that's something very important to acknowledge because it is a nuance. And I may be contradicting a little bit of myself here, but it is important to remember that there's that nuance that pro-social behavior is not always purely altruistic. So, charity giving, for example, whilst it is supporting others, we have to be examining what is the underpinning motive for that. And sometimes pro-social behavior is not driven by genuine care necessarily. Sometimes it's a way of protecting the self from existential anxiety. And that could be very much unconscious, like an unconscious pro-social behavior. So cultural context matters in this very much because what counts as kindness or as empathy or generosity can vary across societies, and so do the motivations behind them. So it's quite important to be able to place this in the context. Okay, so having gone through that and that nuance, those nuances, because they're very important, just to come to a bit of this study and a bit of what we're finding and what that means. So up to this point, well, not up to this point. Let me just come back to the slide again. So why this study? The three key reasons why this study is important is because A, the existing research is mostly laboratory based, which means that we have very limited external validity and ecological validity to be able to view that in real world scenarios. Also, because there's very little evidence to show how cultural silence could be modified, manipulated within real world scenarios, and then measure those outcomes as well. So it becomes quite important. So the biggest study that I'm currently finalizing, so I'm not going to speak here today about all of that, but it is a two-armed randomized controlled trial, which essentially has developed a conversation-based intervention on death and mortality, and it invites lay people from across regions to have scheduled conversations within the community settings on death and grief and mortality that are unstructured and they last a minimum of four consecutive conversations. So it's a 4 week, initially a 4 week period that they engage to, but that could expand to 8 weeks. So there's an ongoing conversation. And then what happens is that there are measurement points where there's a measurement of pro-social behavior, kindness, charity giving, empathy, self-esteem, pro-socialness, and self-consciousness measures at different points so that we can see whether that there is an effect in the change. Now, here today, I'm just going to talk a bit about the proof of concept study, which was the original study attempt with 52 participants to try and test the feasibility of this conversation-based intervention in terms of whether there are indications for changes in people's attitudes following conversations about death. So, so with that in mind, you can see on the slide what the measures are. And right here, you can see a little bit about kind of unpicking some of the key measures. So the empathy, we're talking both about affective and cognitive empathy. When it comes to pro-social behavior, we're talking about voluntary actions that can benefit others. And then kindness, again, benefiting others, but looking inwardly as well. And there are three main hypotheses on the proof of concept study in particular, and you can see those in the screen as well. So mortality-focused conversations that could increase potentially pro-social intentions and charitable giving, whilst self-esteem also rises. Also, that mortality conversations decrease social anxiety that we experience and increase our public self-consciousness, which then creates a psychological condition that supports pro-social behavior. And also that community-focused conversations can amplify pro-social outcomes as well. So that's those are the hypotheses, and this is where we are. And this is just a little bit more, a few more details on the study. I've mentioned most of this, but these are the measurement tools for those that are interested. I get personally a bit excited about statistics and tools, but I don't want to occupy this space with that. But I'm happy to answer questions at the end. And these are the ways that all the data was analyzed, but the power analysis was 80%. At a zero point 0.5 alpha. So what have we found? And apologies, it's just numbers on the screen, but I just want to sort of kind of talk a little bit about what the proof of concept study has found and why it has continued into this randomized controlled trial. So what it has found is that, well, first of all, we're not expecting any dramatic transformations with a proof of concept. What we're looking for were those signals, those early changes that suggest that the intervention is doing something meaningful and something worth testing in a more fully developed randomized controlled trial. And that was the aim here. And thankfully it was successful. So at the beginning of the study, what we see here is that at the beginning of the study, participants showed more moderate self-consciousness, more moderate prosocialness, and we can see that from the skewness of the data. You can just follow my words, I guess. More moderate gratitude as well, and mindfulness measures, as well as relatively high positive effects in terms of I feel good, I feel that I'm worth it, and so forth, and more low negative effects that I don't feel that I'm worth it. The self-consciousness subscale, so there are subscales within the self-consciousness scale that was used, and the subscales were about private self-awareness, so more personal reflections, public self-awareness, so reflections about myself within the community I'm part of, and social anxiety, so my worries about life and about the end of life. And all those three have showed healthy variability, which is exactly what one would want when you test for change. When it's healthy, then it could become a good foundation for measurement. So, in other words, participants came to this proof of concept study with in a fairly typical community, sort of from a fairly typical background and diverse ability. Let's put it that way. But what were the changes over time? And that's the important bit. So after 4 weeks, so these were 4 committed weeks worth of conversations around mortality, death, and grief. And after 4 weeks of mortality-focused conversations, several patterns have emerged from the data. The first one is that self-consciousness of individuals had increased. Equally, other things that increased were pro-socialness, so the tendency for pro-social behavior, a greater gratitude about life and about what people had, not what they wished to have. Also, increased mindfulness amongst the individuals, increased positive effects, so people saw themselves in a much more positive light, and the negative effects had remained, did not decrease, but they remained the same, so there was no increase of that. And in terms of the self-consciousness subscales, which tend to tell us a more interesting story, perhaps, is that while private self-consciousness and public self-consciousness increased following those conversations and during those conversations, social anxiety decreased. So people became less anxious whilst being engaged in those conversations and after the end of those conversations as well. Um, and I guess because this was a small proof of concept study for the purposes I explained earlier, we expected modest effect sizes, I guess. And that's exactly what we found. So we found that there was that trend for increase in self-consciousness, prosocialness, gratitude, mindfulness, positive effects, and private self-consciousness. And whilst the numbers from those are not significant or dramatic shifts, as you see on the screen, they are consistent and they're coherent and they're theoretically aligned together, and they give us a very robust narrative to help us better explore that in real world scenarios with the RCT. But what does this mean? When people talk about uh, death, what does it mean? And this data, it means that when people do engage in conversation in a more supportive environment, they start becoming more self-aware. They're less anxious about how they are perceived by others. They become more grateful. There was a tendency that people tended to use less of social media, in fact, and check what others are doing in their stories following these conversations. They became more mindful and also more inclined toward pro-social behavior. And of course, there are feasibility indicators more generally in terms of the proof of concept because it's important. So there was 100% retention. And while everybody engaged fully throughout, it can also be a disadvantage, in fact, a limitation, because when you have 100% retention and with no attritions, it also means that potentially participants start wanting to provide to the study what the study needs. But that's a different conversation on research methods. And what does it actually mean? It means that um, that this particular approach of having in community settings conversations openly about death is a very feasible and well accepted intervention by people, um, challenging a bit of the myth of people not wanting to talk about death. There's a stronger perception of values in life. There's an emerging psychological shift from those conversations, and while the effect sizes are small, they're meaningful nonetheless. And there's potential that becomes a potential mechanism for change, if you like. So just to think, and I'm going to take 2 more minutes. Do I have time? 2 more minutes, and then we can open up for a conversation. I'm just trying not to take too much. But let's think a little bit about im implications. So first of all, well, there's these 5 key implications that I want to communicate today, and there's much more in the background. But the first one is that it gives us an idea that cultural silence is not malleable. So, in other words, it's not fixed, or it can be fixed, to put it otherwise. So, the findings then show that when people are given safe spaces for those conversations, they start engaging and they benefit from that. And so that means that then silence is cultural, hence cultural silence, but it is not natural. And what we know is that nature might not be able to change. It could be distorted because of disasters, for example, if we have a different conversation, it but culture can be changed, and that's where we start focusing on. Also, that death talk strengthens the social fabric. So, in other words, that the increases in gratitude, in mindfulness, in private self-awareness can point towards something that is really important, which is that death talk can function as a social glue, to put it that way, to use those terms, a social glue. It starts encouraging reflection and empathy and relational depth, if you like. And those are qualities that support, and we know that from his sort of research over centuries in ethnographies and kind of cultural studies, that those qualities start supporting community cohesion, and particularly in fragmented or more individualized societies. So it's those social bonds that I've mentioned earlier. The other implication is the support around the theoretical move towards death literacy as a public health skill. And this is not something new. This is something that even the World Health Organization has been having conversations about, especially once end of life care has been recognized as a human right internationally. So, so the idea here is that it cannot and should not be a specialty of spiritualism or religiosity, but it has to be identified more as a public health skill. The other point is about reflective dialogues and thinking about mortality awareness, which could encourage pro-sociality and pro-social behavior. And again, this has a lot more sub-implications within educational systems, but those can be uncovered at a different time. And lastly, there's that idea of challenging privatization. So if I link it back to Aris's framework and all the contemporary scholars that have talked about that privatization, that the argument is that modernity has really pushed death into more private and medicalized spaces. Um, the reverse order of that would be that when people are invited to discuss, they will willingly start republicizing, if you like, death through that conversation. They will start reopening the gates and deprivatizing that conversation. So if, as many scholars argue, that privatization of death is a problem, and again, that's a different conversation because there are many arguments why that can become a societal challenge, not problem. Then those open conversations could change psychologically individuals to start engaging in a manner that will deprivatize death in itself. And of course, just very quickly to mention, there are some limitations to that. I'm not going to go into detail about it because it's the important but less interesting parts of a study. So there's no control group, hence the randomized control trial, because a control group is added to that study. Actually, two control groups. There's a reliance on self-reporting a lot of these times with these studies, so we have to be mindful of that. The effect size was small, and I've already mentioned. And there's that possible expectancy effect because of the 100% retention that I've mentioned earlier and the lack of attritions. So, just a couple of concluding remarks. I think I'm not going to say much. I'll say that the conclusion, I think, is shown quite nicely in these two extracts here. So, first of all, I don't know how many of you know Michel de Montaigne, and he had famously said that to philosophize is to learn how to die. And he didn't mean that we should obsess over death. He meant that when we face mortality, honestly, we learn how to live with more clarity and more gentleness and more courage. And in a way, that's exactly what the participants in this study have been saying, that they've been practicing being human together. It's exactly what it is. So practicing humanity essentially is part of what we saw in the conversations about death. And also, some of you may be familiar with the poet Rilke, Rainer Rilke, who has written that death is our friend because it brings us into presence with all that is here. And again, the findings of the study sort of echo the sentiment here because even small conversations about mortality have nudged people toward gratitude and mindfulness and connection and social bonds, not despair or fear. So they have made them stronger, not weaker, in terms of social anxiety. So in the psychological terms, weaker. So death didn't pull them away. In other words, is what to say. And I'm leaving you with this slide. People want to talk about death if they're given the right space. And death talk can become quite soft, can soften the anxieties we experience in life. And leaving you with this quote by Mary Oliver that what is the quite famous kind of question or wisdom, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life. And it's a question, about mortality conversations that made unavoidable. And that's precisely where the power of the death taboo is, if you like, or the lack of death talk. So thank you everyone very much. Apologies, I went over by a couple minutes here, but thank you all very much for listening, and I'm very happy to unpick any of those points. And I'm leaving you with an image from my home island here, just because it needs to remind me of what I value very much and where I'd like to be this summer.